Hello and welcome. My name is Susan Gay. I'm the moderator for this session. This session is titled Male Experience Intimate Partner Violence. And my Zoom engineer is Idalmi De Leon, and we will be working with you to make sure that everything goes smoothly during this session. Before we begin and before I introduce you to our presenter, I want to just go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, make sure that you stay muted, except for questions, and the questions will be answered at the end of the second part of the presentation. So this presentation is in two parts. In between, there will be a break of 15 minutes. The first session will be 40 minutes, and then we will have a 15-minute break. You can get up, stretch your legs, get some water, whatever. And then we come back at 2 o'clock, and then Mr. Kozak will continue to present. And at the end of his presentation for the second hour, then he will entertain questions. So stay muted, except for that time when we will be allowing questions. Use your chat feature on the Hoover app to type in any questions, and I will make sure that Mr. Kozak has an opportunity to respond to as many of your questions as possible. I also want to remind you that we have an evaluation that we would like you to fill out at the end of the session. So at the end of the second part, please fill out the evaluation. You will see it in your Hoover app. Under the video where you're seeing, you should see something that says rate session, and you will go there and that should take you to the evaluation. These are very important for us to be able to improve our content and just let us know how we did and let the speaker know how he or she did. So please take some time to fill out those evaluations at the end of the session. Also, we want to let you know that if you fill out your session evaluations or feedback, you are entered for a chance to win a $25 gift card. So again, feel free to use the Hoover chat to answer those questions. This session is entitled Male Experience Intimate Partner Violence. And Mr. Kozak, Matthew Kozak, will be our presenter for this session. Matthew was born and raised on Kodiak Island in Alaska. He's a third-generation Alaskan, and he graduated with his Bachelor of Science in Psychology degree from Tulane University in New Orleans. He also holds several master's degrees in industrial organizational psychology, business administration, and organizational leadership. Mr. Kozak brings a wealth of experience to this forum. He has held several roles. He was at one time a volunteer mentor, tutor for inner city school district, charter school district in New Orleans. He was also an academic subcontractor for the native village of Afognak in Kodiak, Alaska. And he spent nearly 15 years as a commercial salmon fisherman in Bristol Bay, Alaska. Currently, he is a grant and management administrator at CANA's Community Health Division and Behavioral Health Department. So please join me in giving a hearty welcome to Mr. Matthew Kozak. Mr. Kozak, welcome, and it's all over to you.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. I apologize. I'm going to plan to leave my camera off for the majority of the presentation. The joys of living on an island in Alaska, internet stability is not always so great. So just to minimize any issues, I'm going to leave that off. I'll plan to turn it back on during the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and...
That is totally fine. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share the slideshow. So thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for inviting me and having me here. As Susan mentioned, my name is Matthew Kozak. I work with the Kodiak Area Native Association, also known as CANA. I have held a variety of roles in the organization. I started out as a prevention specialist working with the Indian Health Service Domestic Violence Prevention Initiative grant program. I followed that and moved up from a prevention specialist to the department manager, and eventually my current role as a health programs grant manager overseeing our community health division and behavioral health departments. So a little bit of background. Kodiak is the largest island in the state of Alaska. It's the second largest island in the United States. We have a couple of unique kind of geographical features. So we have the city of Kodiak, which is connected to a few other communities by what we refer to as the road system, in that you're able to drive to those. I think from one point to the furthest point that you can drive is only about 3.5 or 4 hours. And then we also have several smaller rural village communities that are dotted around the island and are accessible only by boat and by small aircraft. So as we're going through this presentation and talking about, the need to bolster services and make sure that services are available, these are just some of the unique features that myself and my organization deal with on a daily basis as we're trying to serve our populations. The Kodiak region is home to roughly 3,000 Alaska Native beneficiaries across 10 federally recognized tribes of the Alutiiq and Sugpiaq people. Alaska has a huge number of tribes. I believe it's over 220, composed of a variety of different language and culture groups. And that's going to come into play as we're talking about some of this research about male experienced intimate partner violence. And I'll speak more on that in a few minutes. In addition, Kodiak has the largest US Coast Guard base in the Pacific. There's about 13 to 15,000 year-round residents. Kodiak is primarily a fishing community, and so we see a large population expansion in the summer. And then as kind of a fun fact, we're known for the Kodiak brown bear, and there are approximately 3,500 bears here on the island, which equates to one bear per every, I believe it's 0.9 miles. So about every square mile of land, you can find a bear. So our learning objectives for today's presentation are to increase knowledge about intimate partner violence and other forms of violence experienced by men, examine potential outcomes that are associated with the trauma resulting from that violence, understanding some of the unique barriers that are encountered by men who may be seeking help, and learning about various outreach and engagement programs and some of the next steps that organizations and that we as individuals working within our tribal communities can start taking to really address this issue and the issue of violence overall. More in depth, I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma in Alaska and in the Kodiak region specifically, talk about male experienced intimate partner violence, the impact that that trauma and that violence has on men, those barriers to help seeking, outreach and engagement, and then those next steps moving forward. Before I dive in and start talking about the data, one thing I want to highlight is the bias in the research. And in that, I mean that there are very limited studies that examine specifically male victim intimate partner violence and the impact that it has. In addition, the available research very rarely includes Indigenous populations and Indigenous persons. And when it does, as I'm sure for those who have looked at the research, it typically looks at it as kind of an aggregate general category of American Indian, Alaska Native, that AIAN population. And as we know, that data can be very difficult to generalize. So there are a lot of differences in the language, the culture, the traditions, and the historical traumas that have been experienced by people in the northwestern or northeastern United States, southwestern United States, and in Alaska. As I mentioned, Alaska has over 200 federally recognized Alaska Native tribes with a variety of different cultural and traditional makeups, linguistic groups. And so as we're looking at this research, one of the things I kind of want to highlight is this is the data that's available. It's not necessarily representative of your region, of your population, of your tribal groups and communities. And so just being aware of that, This is designed more to provide some context and some information because, again, there's this bias in the research, there's a lack of information, and it's something that we need to begin looking at. Many of the studies I'm going to cite and talk about are based in other countries or very specific sub areas of the United States. So again, they're representative. And because of that lack of data, the full scope of the problem is really difficult to ascertain and get our heads around. So looking at trauma in Alaska, I want to start with looking at childhood rates, because this is going to come into play as we're talking about services and societal perceptions and the lingering effects of trauma. This graph is from the Alaska Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And beginning in 2013, that survey began asking questions about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This is a 3-year average from 2013 to 15. And overall, it shows that more than 65% of Alaskan adults will have experienced at least one ACE in their lifetime. When you look just at the Alaska Native population, that number is nearly 75%. More than that, nearly 30%, almost 1 in 3 of Alaskan Native adults will have experienced 4 or more ACEs in childhood. That ultimately means that there are more Alaska Native individuals who have 4 or more ACEs in childhood than there are with 0 or any other category. For those who have looked at ACEs data, the general rule is that the more there are, the greater the correlation, the greater the likelihood of negative long-term outcomes, including things like lower educational attainment, severe mental health issues, chronic physical health issues, and, as we'll see in some other areas, later lifetime victimization. In addition to that, I want to note there was a study from the International Journal of Equity Health in 2017, and it found that when it comes to individuals reporting 4 or more ACEs, men are much more likely to fall into that category. And so as we look at that number, with nearly 1 in 3 Alaskan Native adults having experienced 4 or more ACEs in childhood, the odds are that the majority of those, better than a 50% share, are going to end up being men. And that's going to factor in as we're talking about the impact of trauma. Again, looking at Alaska, in 2013, the first year that the state asked that question about ACEs, they ran a comparative study of 5 other states to see kind of where Alaska stood. And they found that when it came to sexual abuse, having an incarcerated family member, substance use in the home, or separation or divorce, Alaska was ranked number 1. For verbal emotional abuse, physical abuse, mental illness in the home, or having witnessed domestic violence, Alaska was number 2. In addition, a publication by the National Coalition of Domestic Violence in 2020 found that nearly 45% of Alaskan women and 30% of Alaskan men have experienced intimate partner violence, including sexual violence and stalking, while more than 84% of Alaska Native American Indian women in the state will experience violence at some point in their lifetime. The Alaska Victimization Survey in 2020, this is a massive survey. It's conducted every few years. It covers both the entire state of Alaska as well as covering specific regions on a rotating basis. To date, it's had more than 13,000 female respondents. Nearly 50% have experienced intimate partner violence, 40% sexual violence, and almost 60% have experienced one or both. In addition, as we're talking about the need for services and the lack of available services, 7% of individuals in this survey required advocacy, but less than 70% were able to access it. 6.8% said they required safe shelter or housing, and only about 84% were able to access it. So looking at my region specifically, as I mentioned with that map of Kodiak Island, where we have those rural village communities that aren't accessible by the road system, the only way that individuals in those communities can access services, whether it be safe shelter, advocacy, consistent behavioral health treatment, is for them to commute into the hub city of Kodiak, which is obviously cost prohibitive, both for the individual and for the organization such as mine that may be bringing them in, because that requires airfare, hotels, and so on. And so being able to provide consistent services is something that my region, as well as other areas in Alaska, and I imagine areas in the lower 48 struggle with. In a 2020 report to the Alaska legislature, it was stated that by the age of 9, nearly 40% of Alaskan children will be reported as a victim of abuse. And Dr. Kathy Baldwin Johnson, a child abuse expert of more than 2 decades in the state, noted that if an Alaskan had a history of being physically abused as a child, there was an almost 36% chance they were sexually abused, over 78% chance they had been verbally or emotionally abused, over 60% chance that one of their caregivers was engaging in substance use, and over 50% chance that they had witnessed their mother being beaten. Looking at Kodiak specifically, the most recent available data from the Alaska Victimization Survey found that 44% of women experience violence, including 38% experiencing IPV and 23% sexual violence. And I want to note this survey did not include non-English speaking women, those without access to a phone, or those not living in a residence. And the authors themselves noted that the estimates may be higher among women excluded from the survey, and the estimates may be conservative because this is based entirely on self-report. One thing to note, going back to that bias in the research, that to date, there have been no men included in the Alaska Victimization Survey. It looks only at violence directed towards women. Since 2017, the Kodiak Child Advocacy Center has been overseen and managed by CANA, my organization. They conduct roughly 100 forensic interviews in a given year. About 40% of their cases deal with sexual abuse. 40% of their clients are Alaska Native. And in year 2020, 72% of children did not engage in behavioral health services to address the trauma and the violence that they had experienced. And the most common reason cited was inadequate access to timely services. So again, that idea of needing more services, more capacity, more funding is going to come up, especially when we begin talking about some of the barriers that men encounter. Ultimately, interpersonal violence is an epidemic in Alaska. This is nationwide. In some of the conversations I've had and some of the information I've seen, this is not unique to our communities. This is something that all tribal communities across the US are dealing with, is these unacceptable rates of violence. Many communities in Alaska, much like in the lower 48, are rural, underserved, and underfunded. There's a variety of unique geographic, cultural, and linguistic barriers that can prevent maintaining adequate service levels. For example, in Kodiak, the only behavioral health resource that a rural village might have is what's known as a behavioral health aide, a paraprofessional. And in some cases, if a person leaves that position, it can remain vacant for weeks or months or longer. And the only consistent behavioral health service that those community members are able to access are either commuting into town, again, at great expense, waiting for a behavioral health provider to make a regular trip out to the village community every 4 to 6 weeks, or with telehealth services. And those barriers, those lack of services, those difficulty accessing services, those things only begin to expand when you focus on male experienced IPV and male victims of abuse. So moving on to look at male experiences specifically, a publication by the US Office for Victims of Crime in 2018 noted that 1 in 4 men have experienced physical abuse, such as being slapped, pushed, or shoved. 1 in 7 have experienced severe physical abuse, being struck with a fist or a hard object, being choked, burned, etc. Nearly 50% of men have experienced psychologically aggressive behavior, such as being kept track of, being insulted, humiliated, either in private or in public, or feeling threatened by their partner, while 4 in 10 have experienced coercive control, such as isolation, blackmail, and economic control. Ultimately, 47% of men will be victims of psychological aggression at some point. 28% will experience some form of physical violence by a partner. 7% will be victims of contact sexual violence. And looking at American Indian, Alaska Native men specifically, more than 40% will experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. About 1 in 19, so a little more than 5% of men, have been stalked to the extent that they felt very fearful or believe they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. Almost 50% of those reported that their stalkers were female perpetrators. 13.5% of male high school students report physical or sexual abuse by a dating partner. It's estimated that more than 1.6 million men have reported being raped. 50% of men report at least one form of sexual aggression victimization, and that includes 43.5% reporting minor aggression, such as verbal coercion, and 28% reporting severe aggression, such as threats or force. From the National Institute of Justice in 2016, 83% of adults have experienced some form of violence. And this publication was interesting because they ran a direct comparison of men and women. And they found that, at least in this sample, nearly 81.5% of men compared to 84% of women reported experiencing violence at the hands of a partner. But the difference is where the violence, or how the violence, is characterized and carried out. And so 73% of men, nearly 3 out of 4, excuse me, compared to about 66.5% of men, experienced psychological aggression, whereas only 43% of men compared to 55.5% of women experienced physical violence. Overall, this particular publication estimates that the lifetime victimization rate for Indigenous adults compared to their white counterparts is 1.2 times for women and 1.3 times for men. So again, as we're looking at our tribal communities and our tribal populations and our beneficiaries, the data is very scarce, but what data is there shows that the rates of violence are unacceptable. For example, the National Institute of Justice Journal found that Indigenous men will experience high rates of lifetime violence, 27.5% experiencing sexual violence, 43% physical violence, 19% stalking, and again, nearly 75% will experience psychological aggression at the hands of a partner. While 1 in 4 will express concern for their safety as a result of a partner's actions, 1 in 5 will report being physically injured, 1 in 10 have reported missing school or work as a result of those injuries and that aggression, and 1 in 6 who needed services were unable to access them. So the trauma and the violence that men are experiencing is pervasive. Even if it's not fully understood, it's not fully researched, the scope and scale of it varies. It varies wildly based on what studies and what information you look at. But the general estimates in the research that I found is somewhere between 30 and 50% of men will experience some form of intimate partner violence, some estimates ranging even higher. And that trauma has severe negative long-term impacts. So a 2014 study in the European Journal of Psychotraumatology conducted a meta-analysis of 58 research studies. Most of them were in the US, but some were from Asia, New Zealand, and various European countries. They found that only 31% of those studies included males and females, while only 4 studies focused entirely on males. So again, going back to that issue of the bias in the research. In these studies, there were over 141,000 participants, and they found that 33 of the research studies noted PTSD as a significant outcome of IPV, that IPV victims were more likely to display PTSD than non-IPV trauma-exposed victims. So if your trauma is a result of violence by a partner, you are more likely to display PTSD and PTSD symptoms than someone whose trauma was a result of crime or a natural disaster or so on. Looking at the types of violence and how that is connected to PTSD, several studies found that psychological violence was a key predictor of developing PTSD and PTSD symptoms. So if we go back to that number, that 75% of Indigenous men will experience psychological violence or aggression at the hands of a partner. And here we're seeing that that specific type of violence is a key predictor of post-traumatic stress disorder. We also see that PTSD in victims of IPV is often associated with depressive symptoms, sleep disturbance, substance use, and suicidal ideation, as well as anxiety, psychological distress, and somatization. So those physical health effects that come as a result of the mental and emotional trauma. These are all taken from a variety of different studies, but basically psychological intimate partner violence has been correlated with anxiety, depression, hostility. Sexual aggression has been correlated with depression and PTSD. Any type of IPV status, whether that's victim only, perpetrator only, or victim and perpetrator, shows higher rates of depression, PTSD, and suicidality. And a study from the American Journal of Men's Health found that intimate partner violence among male victims was associated with a loss of pleasure, depression, sleep issues, lack of energy, change in appetite, feelings of failure, difficulty concentrating, and feeling slow or agitated. With regard to physical health, there's a significant lack of data, but what information I was able to find found that men who experience intimate partner violence are more likely to self-report poor health. They're more likely to display heavy alcohol use and the use of therapeutic or recreational drugs. It's also associated with developing injury and chronic disease. And those victims display increased rates of smoking, drinking, and substance use. For children, intimate partner violence victims were more likely to have experienced or witnessed it as children, and that experience observation is connected both to later victimization and to negative long-term mental health outcomes. So as we go back to the very beginning with that chart that I showed of ACEs in Alaska, where we have nearly 1 in 3 Alaska Native adults reporting 4 or more ACEs in childhood, we're seeing here that that trauma that they're either experiencing or witnessing makes them more likely to become an abused victim later in their lifetime or to experience other negative health outcomes. In addition, a study from the Archives of Sexual Behavior looked specifically at the children of male victims. And they found that preschoolers often display affective problems, oppositional defiant problems, and pervasive developmental problems, while older school-age children will display those same issues in addition to anxiety, ADHD, conduct problems, and they begin seeing physical health manifestations of that mental and emotional trauma that they're experiencing and witnessing. Looking at impacts in other areas of life, a 2009 research study from the US Department of Justice and the University of Arkansas Department of Management looked at 2,400 employees across 3 companies in 39 states to assess the impact of IPV in the workplace. They found that 10% of male and female employees experienced intimate partner violence in the previous year, and nearly 20% of men and 30% of women reported having been victimized at some point in their life. Roughly 20% of employees also reported having experienced IPV at the workplace. Those who reported previous year abuse were more likely to display depression, lower self-esteem, reduced economic self-sufficiency, and increased family work conflict, while those lifetime victims expressed depression, low self-esteem, and heightened levels of job insecurity. The authors essentially noted that previous research establishes the importance of a woman's outcome to her likelihood of abuse. It seems probable that confidence in one's own economic power will be critical to the ability of a victimized woman to extricate herself from a dysfunctional family situation. And then lifetime victims were more likely to display tardiness, absenteeism, while current victims are more likely to be distracted. So again, the author said, simply put, it appears that current victims get to work, but have more difficulty working than non-victims. And this pattern was especially strong for female victims. On the other hand, lifetime victims appear to have more challenges around work attendance, but once at work, they are fully engaged as other employees. Taken together, these findings suggest that victimization has short and long-term detrimental effects on work-related outcomes, but also that IPV victims can recover. So looking at trauma in a broad scope, it has severe psychological impacts, it has severe physical health impacts, it impacts your work life, it impacts every facet of your being. And one of the things that a lot of the research bears out is that whether you are an adult who is a victim of abuse, or if you have grown and you witness these things and experience these things as a child, you are more likely to experience abuse at the hands of a partner as you go through life, and to experience an array of other issues and challenges and problems. And so as we're looking at help seeking and some of those barriers, we need to be looking at not just addressing the immediate issue of the abuse and the violence, but we also need to be looking at how can we help people address and process and overcome their trauma, especially if it's something that occurred when they were children. And that's something we'll talk about more in the second part of this presentation. But for now, looking at some of those barriers to help seeking behavior. And what we see in men is that some of the barriers they encounter are similar to those encountered by women and children, but there are some that are very unique to men because of societal perception. So, for example, fear. Fear is one of the biggest barriers to reporting and seeking help, regardless of the population. The research on men, what's available, seems to indicate that the most common fear that's expressed is of not being believed. So for example, one male victim was quoted as saying, "I did not press charges for the assault because there were no witnesses." And it's interesting to note that men are much less likely to cite fear of the abuser as a reason for not reporting, to the point that female victims are 3 times more likely to express fear of their partner and of retaliation than a male victim. Another male victim explaining why he didn't report his partner noted, "I never felt there was a significant threat to my or anyone else's safety during or after the incident." And this perception, even by male victims, will come back in a future slide as we talk about, men and society recognizing abuse for what it is and the different forms it takes. Another common emotional barrier is shame. This quote was taken from the International Journal of Criminal Justice Sciences in 2010. "Men who report abuse from an intimate partner are viewed as cowards. Extremely embarrassed by this predicament, male victims are afraid of being laughed at or scorned. Due to embarrassment, male victims do not approach professional services." So we have kind of these internal barriers, fear and shame, and a litany of others. And a lot of those are tied to social perception. So for example, one of the most common social perceptions that we run into is the idea that men are perpetrators. So these quotes are pulled from different sources. One of them, "If males are victims of DV, it is due to the self-defense of women who are being abused." Or in one study that I'll go into in more detail as we talk about services, men seeking help were accused of being the batterer in 40%, 32%, and 19% of cases when they contacted domestic violence agencies, hotlines, or resources, respectively. And this final quote, this is taken from a lifelong domestic violence worker and advocate who was speaking about the opening of a men's only domestic violence shelter in Texas. And she noted that the biggest challenge men face is that people don't believe them. "We've gone through a lot of work to get to where women are believed, but now the pendulum has swung to the point that men are assumed to be the aggressor." And Archives of Sexual Behavior in 2014 noted, "One reason that no study has been conducted on the sexual aggression experiences of male victims of physical partner violence who seek help is because few people in the field acknowledge that women can sexually aggress against men. In fact, in a comprehensive review of the intimate partner sexual aggression literature, authors did not consider the possibility of female perpetration against male partners. They use the terms perpetrator and male partner synonymously, and victim and female partner synonymously. All of the theories they discussed also assumed a male perpetrator and a female victim. So this concept that men are the abusers, men are the perpetrators, we're going to see this in the second part of this talk after the break, where we start talking about the legal system bias and the healthcare system bias. And as we start talking about ways to approach and address this issue, that this is a very pervasive construct that needs to be addressed and needs to be overcome if we're going to begin making legitimate strides to addressing violence that is being experienced by men and violence overall. Masculinity, that is another kind of critical social construct that prevents men from reporting and prevents society from effectively responding. So a large component of the shame that we talked about earlier, that idea of being called a coward, that is tied into masculinity, because the idea of being a victim, of being in a position where you need help and where you're the one being abused, is many times completely contradictory to the traditional norms of being masculine and being a man. So for example, a complicating factor in the experience of IPV for men is the impact on their perceived masculinity, given the convergence of the construct of masculinity with power, control, and dominance. As such, becoming a victim of IPV leads to marginalized masculinity. To be labeled as abused is to be labeled as a female, which disavows any form of masculinity a man may attempt to claim. So just as we saw in the previous slides, where men are assumed to be the abusers, the perpetrators, and women are assumed to be the victims, this statement is highlighting the fact that because we have that paradigm where men abuse and women are abused, if you are a man and you are being abused, which category do you fall into? You're either not masculine, you're a coward, you're not a real man because you're being abused, or as we saw in one of the previous quotes, the cause of the abuse is something that you did. You abused your spouse and she retaliated. And so again, at its root, you are the perpetrator. This final quote from the Journal of Family Violence: due to prevailing norms regarding masculinity, men may be reluctant to express fear or to call the police, even when they have every reason to do so. And there was evidence in our study that the men experienced fears that their victimization would result in challenges to their masculinity, with fears that they would be seen as weak. Male IPV victimization seems incongruent with masculine gender norms of physical and emotional strength, which is likely to contribute to male victims' feelings of shame and embarrassment. If you're able to bypass those issues, those few barriers, there's also the perspective that male victim abuse is somehow less serious. So, for example, men's violence against intimate female partners is considered more serious than women's violence against male partners. And in one study that was highlighted in the Psychology of Men and Masculinities in 2019, they noted that both men and women will judge male on female violence as being significantly more severe than female on male violence, and that effect is even larger for male observers. And even if people aren't necessarily denying that or viewing male victim violence as being less serious, in some cases you have outright denial that it's a problem that exists and is pervasive. So despite evidence indicating that within some contexts, IPV is perpetrated equally by men and women, societal narratives typically portray male perpetrators and female victims and regard female perpetrated IPV as less serious and as occurring less frequently. The evidence of the prevalence of male victimization has been the subject of an ongoing and largely unresolved debate. And again, that goes back to that bias in the research and that lack of concrete, large-scale information and studies about male experienced violence. Finally, I know we're coming up on a break here shortly, so I just want to highlight this.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, all right, excellent. So again, with the denial of the problem and the social perception, women's attempts to dominate men are much more likely to fail. Norms for female behavior work against women becoming abusers. These norms include defer to men, be nice, you can catch more flies with honey, soothe other people's anger, and keep the family together. Or we don't see heterosexual men whose self-esteem is destroyed by abuse, who give up school and career progress, who are forced into unwanted sex, or who flee for their lives. People intervene in abuse more than they used to. And if those men were out there, someone would have noticed. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight all three of these quotes, they're from the same source. This was not an opinion piece. This was not a blog or an internet article or anything. These quotes were pulled directly from the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence in fall of 2020. In spring 2021, it was still there. I will note, and I'll talk about a little bit later, it has since been pulled down and it's been replaced as they're overhauling and updating their website. But this particular section, these quotes, was, again, the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. And the section that this fell under was categorizing and characterizing perpetrators and victims of abuse for behavioral health and medical professionals in the state of New York. So this was official guidance that was being put out by state of New York, saying essentially that women can't be abusers because the norms work against them. If they try to be abusers, it's going to fail because, how can a woman abuse a man? And then ultimately saying that it's not real. Men are not being abused. They're not being victimized. And if they are being victimized, somebody would have noticed. And so clearly it's not an issue that we need to focus on, that we need to educate people about, that we need to worry about. So to kind of sum up this first part, trauma is very pervasive in Alaska, nationwide, and among American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous communities and populations. You see rates of violence experienced by men and women that are comparable, depending on which data you look at, even if that violence is characterized differently. So among men, you're much more likely to see that psychological violence, psychological aggression. But as we look at the data about trauma and the lasting, lingering impacts of it, we see that psychological aggression, which is so often treated as being less serious or somehow less damaging, is often a key indicator of chronic mental health and physical health problems, as well as issues that dominate the rest of your life, your workplace, your relationships, and so on. We also see that children who witness this violence, they're also traumatized by it. And that makes them more likely to experience those same impacts and to be victims later in life themselves. So as we continue to talk about some of the ways that these social perceptions and these beliefs begin to manifest in services and in the legal system and ways to address those are the things to keep in mind, that currently violence is experienced by everyone, regardless of sex or gender, at completely unacceptable rates, that is causing a devastating level of trauma and huge lead-on effects that have to be addressed in all populations, not just violence against women, violence against children, violence against elders. We have to look at violence against everyone as we're moving forward and looking at this. And that is the close of that first part.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kozak. That was a very enlightening session. And I want to remind our attendees to this session to fill out your session evaluation on the Hoover app by going to rate session under the screen window and rate this session. We will have a 15-minute break, but Mr. Kozak did say that if anyone wanted to, stay in the room and, chat with him or anything, you're free to do that. Or if you just want to go get some water to drink or, take a bathroom break, you're also free to do that. Remember to put your questions in the chat feature on the Hoover app. And at the end of the next session, Mr. Kozak will definitely be looking at some of those questions and answering those. So we'll see you back at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kozak. That was a really enlightening session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, not a problem. I'll mention it a little bit here later on, but this is something that before I started presenting on this, it was something that I hadn't really seen before. And I'll talk a little bit about, programs to outreach and engage with men. And much like with that social perception of men as perpetrators, so many of the programs out there are kind of couched in the idea that men are either perpetrators, potential abusers, or at the very least, they're bystanders that aren't doing enough.
Mhm.
And as I've been looking at this topic more, and I've given talks about this several times now, it's very clear that as that one person indicated, we've worked so hard and we've made a lot of progress in addressing violence against women, but we've almost completely neglected, half of the population almost.
Right, definitely, definitely. Thank you for bringing this very important subject to light. As you said, violence against anyone, no matter who it is, is worthy of discussion and condemnation. So thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. So as we come back from the break, are you going to want to do another section on housekeeping, or should I just dive straight in?
I just forgot to say one thing that, that this is part of the Men's Health Trap and, who is the funder. So I will just share that briefly, but then you can launch right in.
Okay.
Yeah, that should take me a minute. And the other thing too, I probably may just have to touch on a few things because you never know if some people come on for the first time. You know what I mean?
Right. I expected as much. I included a very quick recap of the first
Okay,
part, just in case we
wonderful.
had some new people join us.
Yeah, yeah. So in that light, I will just do brief introductions again. But
Okay.
yeah, not everything I said at first, but just briefly go over some of the information for anybody who may be new to the session.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, thank you. And feel free yourself to take a break if you need to. I'm going to take a bathroom break. Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Just letting you know I'm here. Delmy, are you there? Mr. Koza, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the session, Male Experience Intimate Partner Violence. This is the second half, and we welcome you back from your break, those of you who are joining us for the second half, and for anyone who is joining us for the first time, we welcome you to this session. Just a few housekeeping things to go over in case you weren't in our last session. We're asking you to mute yourselves and stay muted until the end of this session, when there will be an opportunity to ask questions of the presenter. We're also reminding you to rate the session by going to that box under the screen and clicking rate session and give us your feedback about this session. It helps us to be able to plan future conferences, and it also helps the presenter. For those who fill out the session feedback, you'll be entered into a drawing for an opportunity to win a $25 gift card. Use the Hoover feature, the chat feature, to enter any questions that you may have for the presenter, and at the appropriate time, I will do my best to ask those questions of him. For those joining us again for the first time, our presenter is Mr. Matthew Kozak, who is a third-generation Alaskan who has a wealth of experience in different areas, and currently he oversees and does grant management and administration for Cana's Community Health and Behavioral Health Department. So I'm going, oh, I forgot to say this at the beginning, and I almost forgot to say it again. This session is on the male health track or the men's health track. It is one of 3 sessions that is being sponsored by our grant, Making Connections, that focuses on male mental health and well-being. That grant is funded by Movember Foundation. And so I just wanted to put in a plug there for our funders of this grant and let you know who this track, the men's health track, is being sponsored by. So Mr. Koza, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And so In case we have anyone new joining us, or for those who were here for the first part of this session, there was a lot of information that was covered. So I wanted to provide just a quick recap before we continue on. So ultimately, depending on the sources that you look at and the research on male experienced intimate partner violence tends to be very scarce. But depending on the sources you look at, we can estimate that somewhere between 30 and 50% of men will experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. We know that male experienced IPV often involves psychological violence and aggression. Typically, violence between men and women is characterized as women have a tendency to experience more physical violence than men. Men have a tendency to report more psychological violence. IPV trauma is associated with a variety of negative health and well-being outcomes, such as substance abuse, anxiety, depression, suicidality, chronic physical health problems, economic instability, and in the case of children experiencing or witnessing IPV, later victimization. Men experience a variety of barriers when it comes to help seeking. Some of them are the same, and some of them are different than those encountered by women. Some of the barriers that men typically encounter include a fear of not being believed, feelings of shame or concern about being labeled a coward. There's a strong societal perception that men are abusers. And as we start looking at the legal system and services and some of the biases and barriers that men encounter, that will come back. There's a societal narrative of masculinity that is incompatible with the idea of being a victim and requiring help and assistance. There's also a perception that male experienced IPV is less serious or less damaging. A large part of that is probably that difference in psychological versus physical abuse experienced by men and women. But again, that's a perception that's there. And in some cases, there's an outright denial that male experienced IPV even exists, let alone that it's as pervasive as it is. So as we start looking at some of the manifestations of that social perception and that bias, looking at law enforcement, for example, a 2010 study from the International Journal of Criminal Justice Sciences looked at male victims and conducted interviews about their interactions with law enforcement. And they found that 47%, so nearly half, of male victims of abuse were threatened with arrest. 35% had their reports of the abuse outright ignored, and 21% were arrested instead of the female perpetrator. And the authors noted this is due to the disbelief that a woman could not have been the perpetrator of this type of crime. And so the male must be intimidating the woman to the point that the woman is attacking in self-defense. So again, that perception that men are the abusers. And so even when men are victims of violence perpetrated against them, it's because of something that they did. It's at a root cause, their fault, because they perpetrated violence, and this is the response to it. From the Journal of Family Violence in 2011, in cases where the female partner is identified as the primary aggressor, only 41.5% of the police asked the victim if they wanted the partner to be arrested. In 21%, the police refused to arrest the partner. In nearly 40%, the police said that there was nothing they could do and left. And in 1/4 of qualitative accounts, male victims indicated that police did nothing and ignored or dismissed their claims. One victim was cited saying, they determined that she was the aggressor, but said that since I was a man, it was silly to arrest her. These are from a pair of different studies. A male victim regarding police interaction noted, I was not only not listened to, I was threatened with arrest if I continued to make these allegations because women just do not do these sorts of things. And in another case, some men have reported that when they call the police during an incident in which their female partners are violent, the police sometimes fail to respond. Other men reported being ridiculed by the police or being incorrectly arrested as the primary aggressor. As we move away from law enforcement, we start looking at the court system. One study, 2009 Journal of Family Violence, looked at TRO, or temporary restraining order, petitions from a California district court. And they found that judges were 13 times more likely to grant a TRO that had been requested by a female than by a male. Now, I should note that as the severity of violence escalated, these sex differences started to level out. But as we saw in that first part, looking at the type of violence that men often experience being more in terms of psychological aggression and violence, the fact that we're seeing a 13 times disparity here is very concerning. And the authors pointed out men are significantly less likely to even seek a TRO. One potential reason is lower need. Men are less likely to fear retaliation by their partner. And we saw earlier that women are 3 times more likely to report fear that their partner will escalate or retaliate than are men. There's also the feeling that men believe their petition is more likely to be denied. And as we're seeing a 13 times disparity, there's truth to that. And there's also a reduced willingness and knowledge of how to engage with services due to stigma and bias. So as we saw with law enforcement and in that first section, men are oftentimes assumed to be the perpetrator even when they are the victim of abuse. And so there's a reduced willingness to engage in these services because they have to overcome that barrier. And there's reduced knowledge of how to engage with services because so many services, as we'll see in a few minutes, are targeted specifically at women, or at the very least, they're not advertised as being male friendly or male available. A few others. In 2004, a study found that women often threaten their male victims with the fact that they will report them as having assaulted themselves if the police are called. 2005 study examined the responses of the court to similar intimate partner violence allegations made by male and female victims. It was hypothesized that the courts are not immune from social norms, and that despite having neutral language within the law still exhibits a different response to male versus female protection. The results of the study found that in this particular court setting, male victims of intimate partner violence were not afforded the same protection as female victims. Finally, evidence suggests male underreporting is related to a lack of trust in police and fear of losing their relationships with their children. There's evidence that some female perpetrators capitalize on secondary abuse by threatening to report their victims as the perpetrators of violence. This tactic relies on the inherent assumptions by many social service and justice workers that women are usually victims of violence and has been described as legal and administrative abuse. This type of abuse, in which legitimate services such as family courts are mobilized against the victim's interest, was common enough in a small Australian study to be identified as a wholly distinct category of abuse. So we looked at the social perception of male victim experiences and male victim abuse. And now we're starting to see that manifest with law enforcement and in the court system, where in the case of this and on the previous slide, those systems can actually be turned against a victim by relying on that perception that at the core, the male is the abuser in the situation, regardless of what else may be occurring. There are also barriers associated with language. So for example, one study found that male victims often don't identify with language and terminology such as domestic abuse or family violence. A 2016 study from Portugal, for example, found that 76% of male victims did not seek help. And the most commonly cited reason was, I did not notice that I was a victim. And some of the data from that study suggested that men can be much more responsive to non-gendered synonyms that don't have those social connotations. So instead of domestic violence or family abuse, using a term such as boundary crossings, and then describing the actual behavior. And again, this comes back to those social and societal perceptions that men cannot be victims of abuse. And if they are a victim of abuse, it's because of something wrong with them, that they're weak, that they're not really a man, or that they have some other issue that makes them less masculine, less of a man. Lack of services. As of October 2017, which was the most recent data I was able to find, there were 2 male-only shelters in the entire United States. Now, I do note that publicly funded shelters are required to provide services to men, but many of them have limited capacity or funding to do so. And many shelters and programs use gendered language that gives an impression of limited access. So for example, looking at Kodiak, our primary resource for victims of IPV is the Kodiak Women's Resource and Crisis Center. Now, their website notes that they do not discriminate and they prohibit the denial of services to individuals on the basis of sex. In my time with CANA, I have worked with a variety of staff at the resource center for years, and they are always willing to step in and help and provide advocacy and linkage services for any victim of violence. But the point here is that when you look at the name, if you are a male victim who's experiencing abuse and you are looking for resources to help you, what is your perception of the Kodiak Women's Resource and Crisis Center? That language is becoming a barrier. In addition, KWRCC has a shelter where they can house people on site next to their offices, but that is typically occupied by female victims and their children. If you have a male abuse victim, is it appropriate and is it feasible to house them in that same environment? Not necessarily, because we have to take into account the trauma and the experiences of everyone who's involved in this situation. And so the recourse that KWRCC has is to put them up in a hotel, to coordinate with the Salvation Army or with other agencies and programs in our community. But that goes back to the idea of limited capacity and funding. And so there's only so much that they can do to help male clients, even though they will do their absolute best to do so. This was discussed briefly in the first part of the talk. And this was a study from 2012 in the Journal of Family Violence. And it was highlighting self-reported experiences of male victims seeking and connecting with services. So in the case of domestic violence agencies and programs, 44% of men sought help from these sources, but only about 45% said that that help was somewhat or very helpful. Nearly 50% of the agencies contacted indicated we only help women. 44% said agencies were not helpful at all. And of those, 95% said they were given the impression that the agency was biased against them because they were men. 40% of men contacting agencies were accused of being the batterer, and 15% were mocked by staff members for their situation. Looking at domestic violence hotlines, nearly 1 in 4 men contacted a hotline. Only 31.5% said that they were somewhat or very helpful. Almost 65% of hotlines responded, we only help women. 32% accused the caller of being the batterer, and 16.5% of callers were mocked or ridiculed for their situation. Online resources, 43% said we only help women. 19% accused the man of being the batterer. And in 1/4 of cases where a man used an online resource, they were provided contact information that ended up being for a batterer's intervention or anger management program. Some quotes pulled from that study. For a DV agency, they didn't really listen to what I said. They assumed that all abusers are men and said that I must accept that I was the abuser. They ridiculed me for not leaving my wife, ignoring the issues about what I would need to do to protect my 6 children and care for them. For a hotline, they offered to listen if I wanted to recount what had happened, but indicated that there were no support services available for me. For an online resource, I was mostly just doing research after the occurrence to find out what I should do. I found mostly female help sites and was turned down by several of them, so I gave up. And so again, much like with law enforcement and with the court system, we're seeing the manifestation and the internalization of some of those societal constructs. That idea that men are the abusers and that their experiences are somehow less severe if they're even really occurring. We also see issues in terms of screening. So for example, a survey of 1,000 men attending general practices in Southwestern England found that 92% agreed providers should be screening men about IPV victimization, but only 13% were asked or screened for it. In addition, men who reported experiencing or perpetrating IPV indicated that they were most likely to seek informal support from their friends and family, followed by their family doctor or longtime provider. So those issues in the medical environment where men are not being screened as effectively, if at all, again, we're missing a huge segment of the population potentially. A 2021 examination of validated screening instruments noted the literature review conducted uncovered no published reports describing routine clinic-based IPV screening for men, and only 2 screening instruments that had been validated with men. Looking at my own organization, we recently submitted an application for a new round of Indian Health Services domestic violence prevention funding. And because of my experiences at CANA and because of how prevalent this topic is becoming, we wanted to take a look at what are we doing to address violence in men. And we found that there was a near 0% screening rate for men, with nearly all of our efforts being focused on women ages 18 to 46, children, and elders. Our nursing team indicated that they were not familiar with the indicators or the prevalence of male IPV victimization, and there was no standardized screening tool that had been validated for non-female patients in use. Looking at ER visits in the US, 17% of IPV-related ER visits were by male victims. They tended to skew older, and they also had more injuries as a result of cutting, lacerations, and injuries to the upper extremities, while female victims were more likely to suffer contusions, abrasions, and bruises. In addition, men were more likely to be hospitalized due to their injuries. So as we're talking about the lack of screening and routine inquiry and questioning, we also need to talk about potential differences and bias in red flag warnings when we look at physical injuries and physical indicators of abuse, because as we're seeing here, they're characterized differently. And a lot of that comes back to provider education and awareness that this is an issue and what to look for. So as we look at the prevalence, the trauma, and the impact of it, we look at a lot of those barriers. Now we can move on, outreach and engagement. So how do we begin addressing this issue? How do we begin reaching out to this population? And what we see is that men are historically underrepresented in outreach and engagement efforts. And when they are engaged, when they are involved in this, they often follow that standard paradigm or dynamic that they are either perpetrators, that they are potential perpetrators, or that they are bystanders who aren't doing enough to help women. So a lot of these programs that are designed to reach out and connect with men are not designed to address male experienced violence or male trauma. It's designed to teach us not to abuse women. And so as we're looking at that, just something to be considering, and we'll talk about it. Going back to the idea of screening and healthcare for outreach and engagement, expanding healthcare IPV victimization screenings to include men. And the 2008 article in the Journal of General Internal Medicine noted that most of the arguments for the universal screening of women can easily be applied to men. And so we should be screening everyone. They also noted research shows that universal screening, such as routine inquiry, increases identification compared to screening only those that the provider suspects are experiencing IPV, and that screenings can easily be shifted to check for victimization and perpetration by both parties. That 2009 US Department of Justice research study looking at IPV in the workplace found that nearly 50% of victims will disclose some information to a colleague, but the degree of disclosure is often low. Victims are more likely to disclose to coworkers and supervisors than they are to organizational authorities. And it's typically reported because they need assistance. So they're suffering from decreased job performance, they need emotional support, they need time away from the office to process and deal with what's occurring. Assistance by coworkers is also typically low unless they directly witness or are informed of the IPV by the person experiencing it. But that same study found that victims who disclose report feeling more hopeful about the future. They feel safer, more supported, and are better able to concentrate, while those who disclose do not report feeling socially isolated or that they are viewed negatively. Victims expressing hope also report less depression, higher job satisfaction, greater organizational commitment, less distraction, and lower intention to leave employment. So strong support from coworkers and employers has numerous positive effects. So as we're looking at the workplace and we're discussing harassment policies and harassment training and training on things to notice and on reporting and so on, broadening that out so that it includes everyone and that we're not falling into, again, that kind of standard belief that men are either perpetrators or potential perpetrators, or at the very least, they're not doing enough to help women. We need to begin recognizing that everyone is at risk of experiencing violence, that violence is occurring and victimizing people of all sexes and all genders, and that we need to begin addressing it in a much broader scope than focusing on one particular population and leaving these other groups and these other individuals to either fend for themselves or, in many cases, to be viewed and demonized as the perpetrator and not recognize that they are also experiencing victimization, that they are also experiencing a high level of trauma. Going back to that idea of many outreach programs focusing on men and boys as either abusers or potential abusers, and how these programs are often designed to teach young men not to commit violence. A 2010 report titled "Building Domestic Violence Healthcare Responses in Indian Country, a Promising Practices Report" highlighted a variety of different methods, such as discussing the value of adult men mentoring adolescent and younger boys, teaching coaches, church leaders, and others how to engage boys and men in violence prevention, role modeling, encouraging, and empowering youth to make responsible choices and about respect, and integrating the idea that respect is an aspect of culture. Now, while this report was based on the idea that we need to teach men not to commit violence, it can easily be moved around just a little bit to address trauma and suffering and those negative experiences that men and younger boys have in their lives so that they can begin to heal. And these values and these methods can be applied with all populations to teach that violence in general is not acceptable. It doesn't have to be limited to, we need to teach adolescent and young boys not to commit violence. We should be teaching everyone that violence is unacceptable and not to commit it, because it's not an issue that's limited to a single population. A great example is the SAMHSA Native Connections program. Canada received a grant from this program a few years ago, and the group of Alaskan grantees kicked off a men's wellness digital story series that was focused on providing perspectives from men about the importance of culture, on well-being, and on healing. And the first set of stories debuted in November of 2020 and featured presentations about the value of canoe culture from a young man who had gone through a journey to process and overcome his trauma, as well as traditional beliefs and practices from an elder. So this is a great example of ways that we can leverage technology to reach younger people with a violence prevention message, as well as messages about healing and the importance of processing and recovering from trauma, rather than just trying to ignore it or deal with it individually. Looking at programs that my organization specifically has done, we had one a few years ago that was called Dinner with Dad. And the concept of the program was providing a safe, positive environment for fathers or male guardians and their sons to interact with each other, using a combination of guided and free-form activities and facilitated discussions. We were only able to do a few of these due to funding and staffing restrictions, but the concept of providing those safe male spaces has a lot of value because it allows many of those stigma and barriers that we discussed to be bypassed, especially as you start to delve deeper into these and you're building trust between the participants. You're able to start building some of those relationships and processing and dealing with and ultimately healing from that trauma. The Compass program. I will say that in my 6.5 years with CANA, this is probably my all-time favorite program. From the moment I was introduced to this program, I absolutely loved it. I have used it hundreds of times with all populations. It started as a mentoring curriculum based on adult male mentors working with younger and adolescent boys. And again, it was that idea of we need to teach boys not to be violent and not to be abusers. It was created by the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault with input from elders and storytellers from across the state of Alaska. It was designed to be highly adaptable for non-traditional settings. So you can apply it in a classroom or a school gym, but you can just as easily do it on top of a mountain, on a boat fishing, or out in the woods as you're hunting. And I have used this both with adults, with school age populations, in all manner of contexts, because the lessons that it's based on are things like knowing who you are and where you come from, and having a root in your traditions and your culture and your ancestry, knowing your emotions and how they're impacting you and being able to process and recognize those, having respect both for others and for yourself, having healthy methods of conflict resolution. And in its original incarnation, one of the key pillars and segments was what it means to be a man, what it means to be a man in terms of respect, in terms of processing trauma, how to overcome some of those stigma about fear and shame and so on. And since that time it was first developed, this program has been broadened out to work with all populations. And that segment on what it means to be a man has transitioned more to what does it mean to be a good human being? And that's really the direction that we need to take a lot of these programs. So as we look at moving forward, one thing I want to note is that the landscape is starting to change. There's more and more discussions about this topic that are occurring. I'm being invited to more and more of these types of conferences to give presentations about this topic. I'm seeing it come up more and more frequently. More research is being done on male experienced IPV. It's starting to become much more prevalent in the research. Studies are getting funding and being conducted on a wide array of topics. More services are broadening their approach and moving from a we only serve this population to we serve everyone. More providers are recognizing the seriousness and the scale of this issue and are looking for resources and ways to address it. During the first part, I highlighted this from the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence in the context of denial of the problem of male abuse. And they noted things like women's attempts to dominate men are much more likely to fail. Norms for female behavior work against women becoming abusers. And people intervene in abuse more than they used to. So if abused men were out there, someone would have noticed. Well, as of a few weeks ago, they have taken that down. The Office for Prevention of Domestic Violence is overhauling their website, and they've included a section about unique experiences for specific populations. And they have a section that's dedicated to male victims. It only contains these 3 bullet points: that abusive men is often treated as less serious or a joke. There's a false belief that there are no resources or supports available for male victims. And there are pervading beliefs or stereotypes about men being abusers. Now, this doesn't really do anything to change norms. It's not super proactive or super helpful. It doesn't do anything to overcome the idea that the abuse is less serious, to provide those resources. But the point is that they're moving in that direction and they're building this out. We also see that there are changes we can make in terms of medical and behavioral health practices. So using screening tools that are validated to work with non-female populations, having gender neutral screening practices, not just policies and procedures, but actual practices that we make sure that are being implemented so that we're screening universally, and educating providers about the prevalence and the nature of male experienced abuse so that they know what to look for and they know why it's important to look for it. In terms of the legal system, training and education for first responders and advocacy for more equal treatment under the law. For the public, improving awareness about the prevalence of male victim violence and what it looks like and why it matters, and reducing some of the stigma and some of those barriers so that men are better able to come forward and seek help. And in terms of services, just simple things like improving the language to make sure that it reflects the population you're working with. If your program is working with all populations, all sexes, all genders, titling it the women's program or the women's shelter or the women's resource center is adding an artificial barrier. And even if it's not the reality, we want to combat the perception as well. And then finally, adding male-friendly, if not male-focused services, because abuse is systemic and universal, but the way the abuse occurs, what it looks like, and some of the effects that it has are not necessarily universal. So having services that are male-friendly, if not at least male-focused, is really the way that we need to move forward to begin addressing this. So to kind of conclude everything, male experienced intimate partner violence is real and it's very prevalent. It's occurring at rates that are comparable to, if or slightly below, the rates of violence committed against women. Even if it looks differently, it's unacceptable and it's causing tremendous damage in our communities. The trauma that results from that violence has lifelong effects, whether it's something that's occurring to you now in the moment or something that was witnessed as a child. And most importantly, violence against all people, including violence against men, can be addressed if we are willing to have those conversations, if we're willing to look at our current systems and make an effort to recognize and work with this population and not just shove them off to the side and say, your problems are less serious, your problems don't matter, or in the cases of many things, you've brought this on yourself because ultimately you're the perpetrator and the instigator of the violence against you. So that is everything that I have. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen and hear this in the second part, and I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kozak. That was an excellent presentation and very, very valuable information. I know one of the main questions that people have after a presentation like this is, can you share or where can we get the recording? So you will have access to recordings. You don't have to pay for them. We will tell our community, our conference community, when the recordings will be available, and then you can have access to them for up to a year. So these recordings will be made available to those who want to access them. Again, Mr. Kozak, thank you very much for this presentation. It really is educational. As you said, we are very accustomed to hearing about intimate partner violence as relates to women, but it is not so much talked about intimate partner violence as relates to men. So this has been very enlightening. There's one message in the chat, and we have time for about 9 minutes for questions. I have a few myself, but one person wants to know, do you have an MIW organization in your area that stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women? So do you have an organization like that in your area?
Not in our region in particular, not in the Kodiak region. I am not sure about other parts of Alaska, but in my 6.5 years or so with our domestic violence program and working with our partners at the Women's Resource Center, it is not something that has come up or I've been made aware of.
Okay, thank you. And pivoting back to what you have shared with us about the language and everything, is there a problem with missing and murdered Indigenous men? Have you encountered anything like that? Because one thing I've learned from this presentation now is not just to make assumptions that it can happen to one sex and not the next. So since this is about male intimate partner violence, do you know of any such things?
You know, off the top of my head, I do not.
Okay,
I will admit I haven't looked too deeply into it, but
okay.
I will note that like we see with a lot of the other research,
Mhm.
the research looking at the violence that's experienced by men is very scant. And when
Right,
you do find it, it's usually very broad. And so the resources looking at Indigenous men, for example, are very, very rare and far between. And they're almost always in the aggregate. They're not based on a specific region or
right.
tribal group or culture. It's just, this is what we had.
Right, right.
So
I appreciate that. So that was one of my questions. Since the research is so sparse, how can this problem be remedied in terms of getting more research and specifically to research that focuses on Indigenous people?
mhm. I think I would say that I think a lot of it, excuse me,
Mm.
comes from needing to recognize and raise awareness about the issue. Because one of the things that I've tended to notice is that as awareness and education about an issue is raised and increased, then people are much more willing to look at the problem and willing to start putting the money and the resources to research it in depth. And so
Okay,
I think we're a little bit in like a chicken or the egg situation where we don't really have the research to talk authoritatively on the subject. But
right.
at the same time, if no one is talking about the subject, there's no incentive to do the research and there's no one who's going to be willing to look at it. So I think the biggest part is starting in your local area and having conversations with your tribal groups and your tribal leadership and saying, you know, is this a problem that we are experiencing? And if so, how can we determine what the scope of it is?
Okay, thank you. Very, very, very enlightening. I have another question for you. You talked a lot about stigma and bias towards male experience intimate partner violence. So what steps can be taken practically to reduce stigma and bias towards male experience intimate partner violence?
Again, I think the biggest thing is focusing on education, because the most prevalent thing both in the literature and in subjective experience is that concept that men are the abuser, or if you're looking at engagement programs for younger men, it's essentially saying you are a potential abuser and we have to teach you not to abuse women. And
Okay.
so what we need to do is we need to start changing the focus of that by saying that anyone is a potential victim of abuse. And so we need to teach everyone that violence is unacceptable, and that if you do experience violence, that we are there for you, that we care, and that we're able to help and provide resources. And I think if you're able to begin doing that, you'll start overcoming that stigma and those barriers that oftentimes prevent men from coming forward.
Okay, thank you. One final question, or probably not final, but as long as the time lasts. What are some practical solutions to get men who have experienced intimate partner violence to seek help? I know it probably pivots back to the education and everything, but I don't want to assume, so I want to ask.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a part of it. But another part of it is promoting the availability of those services. So for example, I use the example here in Kodiak, where we have the Kodiak Women's Resource and Crisis Center, and they do serve men. They have men who call their hotline, they have men who come in for services. They have never turned anyone away. But if you aren't necessarily aware of that and you reach out to that organization, or you're looking at resources to help, that language and just that name and that title acts as a form of a barrier. And so I think promoting the availability of the services is a big one. We saw in the one study looking at men engaging in the court system.
Mhm.
And one of the big reasons cited for men not seeking temporary restraining orders, for example, was they didn't know how to engage because there was no real education or resource to help them navigate the system. And so promoting those resources and making sure that people are aware that yes, male violence does occur. And if you have experienced violence as a man, there are resources that are available to you. And this is how you can access them. Because by
Okay.
promoting those resources, then hopefully we can encourage more men to come forward and engage in services, which not only helps them individually in their situations, but as we see more and more people doing that, we begin to normalize it. And that has a cascading effect.
Okay, wonderful. So what I hear you saying is that messaging too is important.
Mhm.
So all-inclusive messaging, your messaging in a sense that is neutral and that is not gender specific can be helpful.
So I would say yes, but I would say that where we are at right now, we almost need specific targeted messaging at men,
Okay,
or
okay,
even a form of counter messaging to counteract that, men are abusers, male violence doesn't occur in any
okay.
significant rates. Because if we make the switch to gender neutral language and messaging and promotion,
Mhm.
there's still that societal perception and that stigma that will prevent men from accessing services,
Okay,
because for so long there was a barrier there. So even if we just remove that barrier, there's still a perception that it's there and that
okay,
they're just changing the language to make it more inclusive, but it doesn't actually matter because
okay.
I'm still not welcome here.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I'm glad I asked that question, and I'm glad that you were able to give that response. One last question. You said that there were 2 shelters in the US that focus specifically, that cater specifically for men. Do you know where those are?
I would have to go back and look at the article. And again,
Okay,
now I know that one of them was in Texas because it was an article about the opening of a new men's only shelter in Texas.
okay,
I don't recall where the other one was.
okay,
And again, this was from several years ago, so
okay.
it very well may have changed.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much. Again, this has been a very enlightening presentation. Thank you so much to our attendees. And as a reminder, fill out your session evaluation and let us know how this session, give us your feedback so that we can continue to plan sessions like this. You'll be entered into a drawing for a $25 gift card, and it would help us to improve our conference. So Mr. Kozak, thank you very much again. And to our attendees, thank you for attending this session.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.